September 15, 1983. A yellow school bus carrying 23 students and their teacher disappeared without a trace on a foggy morning in Pinecrest County. The bus left the school parking lot at exactly 8:15 a.m., headed for the Natural History Museum just 30 miles away. What should have been a routine field trip turned into one of the most baffling mysteries in the region's history. No distress calls, no witnesses, no explanation. The bus and everyone aboard simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind devastated families and a community frozen in grief. For decades, theories circulated from kidnapping to voluntary disappearance, but without concrete evidence, the case grew cold. That is, until last month, when a recreational diver made a discovery that would finally begin to unravel a 41-year-old mystery. The morning of the disappearance had been unusually foggy, the kind of thick mist that swallows sounds and distorts shapes. Locals still remember how the fog had rolled in from the river valley, blanketing the small town in a ghostly shroud. You couldn't see 10 feet in front of you, recalled Martha Jenkins, who had been working at the gas station near the school that morning. She remembered watching the bus's hazy yellow outline disappear into the whiteness, its taillights glowing like distant stars before fading completely. The conditions were treacherous for driving, but the field trip had been planned for months, and cancellations were rare in those days. The bus was driven by Gerald Thompson, a man with 20 years of experience and an impeccable safety record. He knew every bend and dip in the route to the museum. Parents had kissed their children goodbye that morning, expecting them home by dinner time with excited stories about dinosaur bones and ancient artifacts. Instead, the evening brought police officers at their doors with questions no one could answer. The search operation mobilized immediately and grew to unprecedented proportions. Helicopter sweeps, ground teams with search dogs, and volunteer groups combed every inch of the supposed route and surrounding areas. Radio communications from that day reveal the growing confusion and desperation as hours turned into days without any sign of the missing bus. "It's like they were plucked right off the earth," said Sheriff Daniel Roberts in a press conference 3 days after the disappearance. The investigation explored every possible angle: mechanical failure, driver health emergency, kidnapping. Even the far-fetched theory that the driver had deliberately diverted the bus as part of some elaborate plan. Roadblocks were established across state lines. The FBI joined the investigation within 48 hours, bringing additional resources and expertise. But despite the massive effort, not a single meaningful clue emerged. No skid marks on any road, no broken guardrails along any ravine. Reported sightings after the bus left school grounds. Among the 23 children on board was 10-year-old Isabel Isa Reyes, a bright girl with a passion for collecting rocks and fossils. Her mother, Alina Reyes, was perhaps the most vocal of all the parents, refusing to believe that her daughter could simply disappear without explanation. "The authorities want us to accept that they're gone, but I won't stop until I know what happened to my baby," she told reporters a year after the disappearance. Alina kept Isabel's room exactly as she had left it that morning, backpack half packed with a sandwich and apple for lunch, her favorite stuffed bear sitting on the bed waiting for her return. On the wall hung a calendar where Isabel had circled the field trip date with red marker and drawn excited stars around it. While other families eventually moved away from Pinecrest to escape the painful memories and persistent media attention, Alina stayed, convinced that one day she would find answers. The case of the missing Pinecrest school bus became something of a local legend over the years. Children growing up in the area would dare each other to spend nights near the old route, where the bus was last known to have traveled. Ghost stories emerged. Tales of hearing children's laughter in the fog or the distant rumble of a school bus engine on quiet nights. The disappearance fundamentally changed the community. Field trips required multiple chaperones and extensive safety protocols. Parents became more protective, more fearful. The school erected a memorial garden with 24 stone benches, each bearing the name of a person lost that day. Every year on the anniversary, the town would gather there for a remembrance ceremony. As the decades passed, the crowds grew. Smaller, but Alina Reyes was always there. Placing a fresh rock on her daughter's bench, continuing the collection Isabel never got to finish. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved. The families forever left wondering about the fate of their loved ones, until a chance discovery would change everything. Amy Davidson had always felt a strange connection to the Pinecrest bus disappearance, though she wasn't even born when it happened. Growing up in the neighboring town, she'd heard the story countless times, from her parents, from teachers who knew someone affected, from the annual news reports on the anniversary. Now, as a freelance journalist at 38, she found herself increasingly drawn to cold cases and unsolved mysteries. There's something about giving voice to forgotten stories, she often told colleagues when explaining her fascination. Her apartment walls were covered in timelines and newspaper clippings, not just from the bus case, but dozens of others. Yet, the Pinecrest mystery held a special place in her investigation board. It was the first one she'd pinned up, the one that had sparked her interest in investigative journalism. Amy had interviewed many of the still living family members over the years, building relationships and trust where previous reporters had only sought quick sound bites. She knew their pain intimately, had seen it in their eyes, heard it in the catch of their voices when speaking about their lost children. The 41st anniversary of the disappearance had just passed when Amy received a call that made her heart race. It was from Alina Reyes, now in her 70s but still sharp and determined as ever. They found something in the river, Alina said, her voice a mixture of hope and dread. A diver found metal. Large pieces. They think it might be a bus. Amy grabbed her recorder and notebook and drove straight to Pinecrest, breaking speed limits the entire way. The Blackwater River ran about 15 miles east of the route the bus should have taken that day. It was deep, with strong currents, and poor visibility notorious among local fishermen and rarely explored by divers. Martin Cole, an experienced diver mapping underwater caves in the area, had literally bumped into what he described as a large metal structure approximately 60 feet below the surface. Initial sonar scans confirmed a bus-sized object embedded in the silty riverbed. Within hours of Martin's report, the area was cordoned off, and a specialized recovery team was being assembled. Amy arrived just as state police were setting up their command center on the riverbank. The recovery operation was complex and painstaking. Heavy equipment had to be brought in through dense forest, and visibility underwater was near zero. Amy watched from behind police lines as divers disappeared into the murky water, tethered to the surface by safety lines. She interviewed Martin, who described the eerie feeling of his hand touching the metal in the darkness. It was covered in sediment, but I could make out the shape of what looked like a wheel well, he explained. I've been diving for 20 years, and I've never had a moment like that, realizing what I might have found. Alina Reyes stood vigil at the site day and night, refusing to leave even when officers suggested she rest at home. Other families began to arrive as news spread, creating a somber reunion of people bound by decades of shared grief. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation and fear. They all wanted answers. But after 41 years, were they ready for what might be revealed? The first confirmation came when divers recovered a small metal plate, the vehicle identification number was partially visible, and it matched the missing school bus. The operation to raise the bus took 3 full days. Special airbags were positioned underneath the frame, and massive pumps worked to clear mud and debris. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting live as the first glimpse of faded yellow emerged from the water's surface. Amy stood beside Alina, holding the older woman's hand as they watched in silence. The bus broke the surface at 2:17 p.m. on a clear Tuesday afternoon, water cascading from its rusted frame. It was largely intact, though the roof had partially collapsed, and all the windows were gone. The rear emergency door hung open on one hinge. As the crane swung the bus onto the shore, a collective gasp went through the crowd. The front of the vehicle showed massive damage. The hood crumpled backward, the windshield frame twisted. Something had struck the bus with tremendous force. Elena's grip tightened on Amy's hand, her whispered words barely audible. "Where are they? Where's my Isabel?" The question hung in the air as forensic teams approached the recovered vehicle, preparing to search for remains and evidence that might finally explain what happened on that foggy morning in 1983. The investigators moved methodically, treating the riverside as a crime scene. The coroner and forensic anthropologists arrived, setting up examination tents away from public view. Amy watched as they entered the bus, their faces grim and professional. Hours passed with no official statements, but rumors began to circulate. Among the gathered crowd, some claimed the bus was empty. Others whispered that remains had been found still, strapped in the seats. Elena refused to leave, setting up a lawn chair nearby, her eyes never leaving the activity around the bus. Night fell, and floodlights illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the muddy ground. Around midnight, the county sheriff approached the waiting families. His expression was unreadable as he asked them to gather for a briefing. Amy stood at the back, recorder in hand, as he delivered the first official findings. The bus contains some personal effects, backpacks, a teacher's bag, some items of clothing, but we have not found any human remains inside the vehicle. A murmur of confusion spread through the group. "What does that mean?" someone called out. "Where are they?" Elena demanded, echoing the question that had haunted her for 41 years. The mystery had only deepened with the bus's recovery. If the children and teacher weren't on the bus, where had they gone? The damage to the front of the vehicle suggested a violent collision, yet there were no bodies, the sheriff explained. That the rear emergency door had been opened, indicating a possible evacuation. "We're exploring all possibilities," he assured the families, though his tone lacked conviction. Search teams began combing the riverbanks for half a mile in each direction. Underwater drones scanned the riverbed around where the bus had rested. Amy approached Elena after the briefing, finding the woman staring at the bus with a mixture of disappointment and renewed determination. "This isn't the end," Elena said firmly. "This is just the beginning. Now we know where the bus ended up, but we still don't know what happened to our children." Amy nodded, her journalistic instincts firing on all cylinders. She began making notes about the possible scenarios. Had the children survived the crash and tried to find help? Had someone removed them from the bus before it sank? Or was there a more sinister explanation? The recovery of the bus wasn't the end of the story. It was simply the turning of a page in a mystery that had spanned more than 4 decades. The initial forensic examination of the bus revealed crucial details. The impact damage was consistent with the bus having gone off a cliff or high embankment before entering the water. Mud samples lodged in the undercarriage were being analyzed to determine the exact entry point. The river had changed course slightly over the decades, making it difficult to pinpoint. Most significantly, investigators found the bus's emergency roof hatches open, along with the rear door. "The evidence suggests a coordinated evacuation," explained Dr. Miriam Walker, the lead forensic scientist. "The driver, and possibly the teacher, would have directed the children to use all available exits. Tire mark analysis indicated the driver had attempted to brake before impact. The steering column showed signs that it had been forcefully pushed into the driver's area during the crash. Gerald Thompson had likely been severely injured or killed instantly. The driver's window was shattered outward, possibly from rescue attempts. While the bus was mostly empty of personal belongings, Investigators found one item that sent chills through everyone present: a small backpack, preserved in a sealed compartment, with the name Isabel Reyes carefully written on the inside tag. When Alina was shown her daughter's backpack, she broke down, cradling it as if it were the child herself. Inside were Isabel's treasures: a small notebook filled with childish drawings of rocks and fossils, a half-eaten packet of fruit candy, and a disposable camera. The film, Alina whispered through tears. There might be pictures. The camera was immediately sent to a specialized lab that dealt with recovering images from damaged film. Amy stayed with Alina, supporting the woman who had spent more years searching for her daughter than she had spent raising her. Together they waited for news of the film development, while elsewhere, teams continued to analyze every inch of the bus. The investigation expanded to review geological surveys of the river and surrounding area from 1983. Historical weather data was re-examined, focusing on river levels and flooding patterns. Old topographical maps were compared with current ones to identify changes in the landscape. The question on everyone's mind: how could a school bus crash into a river 15 miles off its route without anyone noticing? And more importantly, if the children had evacuated the bus, where had they gone afterward? The developed photos from Isabel's camera brought the first real breakthrough. Most of the images were what you'd expect from a 10-year-old blurry. Shots of classmates on the bus, pictures out the window of passing scenery. But the final 3 photos on the roll sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The first showed the bus stopped on an unfamiliar dirt road, the teacher standing outside looking concerned. The second captured what appeared to be another vehicle parked ahead of the bus, a dark-colored van with no visible license plate. The third and final image, partially damaged by water, but still discernible, showed a man in a uniform approaching the bus door. That's not a police uniform, noted Detective Sarah Chen, who had been assigned to lead the reopened case. The cut is wrong, and there's no visible badge. The photos were immediately released to the public, along with an appeal for information. Had the bus been deliberately diverted? Who was the man approaching the bus? After 41 years, the photos provided the first visual evidence that something more complex than a tragic accident might have occurred that foggy morning. Amy threw herself into researching everything about Pinecrest County in the early 1980s. She dug through newspaper archives, land ownership records, and old police reports. A pattern began to emerge in the 2 years before the bus disappearance. There had been several reports of a dark van approaching children near schools in neighboring counties. The reports had never been connected to the Pinecrest case before. Amy also discovered that a private logging company had owned large tracts of land along the river at that time. Their records showed a network of unmarked service roads that didn't appear on public maps, roads that could have provided access to remote sections of the riverbank. Most intriguingly, she found mention of an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the forest, about a mile from where the bus was recovered. The property had changed hands multiple times since 1983, but it had been owned by a man named Victor Crane at the time of the disappearance. Crane had left the area abruptly in late 1983, selling the property well below market value. Amy took her findings to Detective Chen, who listened with increasing interest. "We need to find this lodge," the detective said finally. "And we need to find out everything we can about Victor Crane." The hunting lodge was barely standing after decades of neglect. Roof partially collapsed, windows broken, nature reclaiming the structure inch by inch. Detective Chen led a team of officers and forensic specialists through the overgrown path to the building, with Amy and Alina following at a distance, their presence technically against protocol, but permitted due to the unusual circumstances. The interior was a mess of rotted furniture and animal nests, but the team worked methodically, section by section, in what had once been a basement storage area, accessible through a trap door hidden under a moldy rug. they found something unexpected. A room with 24 small beds, arranged dormitory style. The walls had been soundproofed with now decaying foam panels. A heavy metal door, rusted in the open position, had multiple locks on the outside. Alina gasped when she saw crayon drawings on one wall, faded but still visible, of stick figures with sad faces. Amy felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized the implications. "They were kept here," she whispered, voice breaking. "The children were brought here after the crash." But if that was true, what had happened to them afterward? And who was responsible? The discovery at the hunting lodge transformed the investigation from a historical accident inquiry to an active criminal case. The FBI officially rejoined, bringing specialized resources for cold cases involving children. Background checks revealed that Victor Crane had died in 2012. But he'd had an associate, Raymond Wells, who had also lived in the area during 1983. Wells had a juvenile record that had been sealed. But with a judge's order, investigators gained access. The record showed disturbing behavior toward younger children when Wells was a teenager. After leaving Pinecrest, Wells had been investigated twice for suspicious activities around schools in other states, but charges were never filed due to insufficient evidence. The most recent information placed him in a small town in Nevada. Detective Chen dispatched officers to locate and interview him, while forensic teams continued processing the lodge. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to search the property for any signs of disturbed earth or hidden structures. The 24 families, now connected by a new thread of terrible possibility, gathered daily for updates. Alina, who had spent decades demanding answers, now seemed almost afraid of what those answers might be. Raymond Wells was living in a trailer park under the name Ray Wilson. When officers approached his home, the 67-year-old man attempted to flee, but was quickly apprehended. His trailer contained newspaper clippings about the Pinecrest case and other missing children cases from across the country. A search also revealed a locked metal box containing 24 small items, what appeared to be trophies taken from children. Among them was a small rock shaped like a heart, with the initials IR carefully painted on one side. When shown a photograph of this item, Alina confirmed through tears that she had helped Isabel paint it just days before the field trip. She said it looked like a heart, and she wanted to give it to her best friend, Alina explained. She was going to give it to her after they got back from the museum. The rock was the final piece that connected Wells directly to the missing children. When confronted with the evidence, Wells remained silent, requesting a lawyer. But the investigation had gained unstoppable momentum. If Wells knew what had happened to the children, they would find a way to make him talk. While the legal process began against Raymond Wells, Amy continued her own investigation. Something about the case still bothered her. If Wells and Crane had been working together, how had they managed to handle 24 people, most of them children? And why had they targeted this specific bus? She began researching Gerald Thompson, the bus driver, looking for any connection to the two men. What she discovered was disturbing. Thompson had briefly worked security at the same logging company that owned the land where the hunting lodge was located. Employment records showed he had been fired 6 months before the disappearance after an unspecified dispute with management. One name on his termination paperwork stood out: Victor Crane, who had apparently been a mid-level manager at the company. Amy took this information to Detective Chen, who immediately ordered a deeper background check on Thompson. The results were revealing Thompson had a sealed record as well, for an incident involving inappropriate behavior with a minor 15 years before the bus disappearance. He'd been hired by the school district before comprehensive background checks were standard procedure. The theory began to take shape. What if Thompson hadn't been a victim but a participant? What if he had deliberately driven the bus to the prearranged location? The case broke wide open when one of Wells' neighbors came forward with crucial information. The elderly woman reported that Wells had regular visitors, adults in their late 40s or early 50s, who would stay for a few days and then leave. They always came at night, she explained. Always hugged him like they were family. Acting on this information, detectives began surveillance on Wells' trailer and documented 3 visitors over a 2-week period. When they ran facial recognition on these individuals against age-progressed photos of the missing children, they got matches. These weren't victims coming to confront their abuser. They appeared to be willing participants in whatever had happened. The first person they approached was identified as former student Michael Collins, now living under the name Michael West. When confronted by authorities, Collins broke down immediately. "We were never supposed to talk about it," he sobbed. "We promised we'd never tell." The story he told defied everything investigators had assumed. The children hadn't been victims of a traditional abduction. They had been recruited into what Collins described as a new family, what authorities would recognize as a cult. According to Collins, Gerald Thompson had been working with Crane and Wells for months before the disappearance, identifying vulnerable children from troubled homes. "They told us we were special," Collins explained. "That we were chosen to start a new community away from the corruption of the outside world." The teacher, Ms. Winters, had also been part of the plan. Having been romantically involved with Crane, the bus crash had been staged, driven deliberately into the river after the children had been safely removed. The damaged front end was created by pushing another vehicle into it after positioning the bus near the water. The children had been taken to the hunting lodge initially, then moved to a compound in rural Nevada. There, they were given new names and told their old lives were over. Some, like Collins, had eventually accepted this new reality. Others had tried to escape or contact their families, but were caught and severely punished. As the children grew older, some were allowed to leave for brief periods to work and bring money back to the group. By the time they were adults, many had become so institutionalized that they couldn't imagine life outside the community. Collins claimed he had only recently begun to understand how wrong the situation was, after discovering Wells and Crane had done the same thing to other groups of children. The investigation expanded rapidly, with FBI agents raiding the Nevada compound Collins had identified. There they found a community of about 60 people, including some of the missing Pinecrest children, now adults in their early 50s. Others had left the compound years earlier, building lives under their new identities. Though many maintained contact with the group, some, tragically, had died over the years from untreated medical conditions, work accidents, or suicide. Ms. Winters was still alive, now an elderly woman who seemed to genuinely believe in the mission of separating the children from corrupt society. As the FBI conducted interviews with the found survivors, a complex picture emerged of indoctrination, manipulation, and the powerful psychological bonds that had kept many from seeking help, even when they had opportunities to do so. Some had been told their families had died or didn't want them anymore. Others had been convinced that they would be arrested or punished if they ever revealed themselves. 19 of the 24 missing persons were ultimately accounted for, 13 still alive, 6 confirmed deceased over the years. 5 remained missing, their fates unknown. Among those still missing was Isabel Reyes. Alina received the news about the found survivors with conflicted emotions. While relieved that some families would be reunited, she struggled with the continued uncertainty about Isabel. Collins and 2 other survivors remembered Isabel from their early days at the compound. "She never stopped talking about going home," one woman recalled. She kept a collection of rocks hidden under her mattress, saying she was going to give them to her mom someday. According to their accounts, Isabel had been among a group of children who had attempted to escape in 1987, when they were 14 years old. 3 children had fled into the desert surrounding the compound. 2 were caught and brought back, but Isabel had never been found. The group leaders told the others that she had died in the desert from exposure, but no one had ever seen proof. Given this new information, search teams began combing the desert areas around the former compound, looking for any evidence of what might have happened to the teenage Isabel. Amy stayed with Alina through this process, witnessing the older woman's remarkable strength even as hope and despair battled within her. If she made it to that desert, Alina said firmly, my daughter would have kept going. She was always so determined. A week into the desert search, investigators found the remains of a small campsite in the hollow of a rock formation, about 15 miles from the compound. The site contained the remnants of a makeshift shelter and evidence that someone had survived there for at least a few days. Among the items recovered was a small tin box containing several unusual rocks and a crude map drawn on a piece of cloth. Forensic analysis confirmed traces of DNA matching Isabel's profile from items in her recovered backpack. The map showed what appeared to be landmarks and a route heading east, toward a highway that would have led to civilization. Alina touched the box of rocks with trembling fingers. She was still collecting them, she whispered. She was still my Isabel. The discovery reignited the search, now focusing on communities along the highway where a teenage girl might have emerged from the desert in 1987. Old police reports were reviewed for any mentions of unidentified minors. School enrollment records were examined for new students appearing without clear backgrounds. The search for Isabel Reyes entered a new phase, no longer a missing child, but a missing teenager who might have created a new life for herself after escaping unimaginable circumstances. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A true crime podcast had been covering the Pinecrest case developments, and after an episode about Isabel's escape, they received an email from a woman in Oregon. I think you're talking about my neighbor, the message read. She appeared in our town as a teenager in the late 80s, calling herself Belle Richards. She never talks about her past, but she collects unusual rocks and gets upset whenever school buses are mentioned. Detective Chen and Amy flew to Oregon immediately, with Alina following on a later flight. They found a modest house on the outskirts of a small coastal town, with a garden full of flowering plants and a workshop visible through a side window. As they approached the door, Amy noticed painted rocks lining the garden path, each one decorated with intricate patterns. A woman in her early 50s opened the door, her dark hair streaked with gray, her eyes wary but curious. She looked from Detective Chen to Amy, a flicker of recognition crossing her face when she saw the journalist. You've been covering the bus story, she said quietly. I knew someday someone would come. When asked directly if she was Isabel Reyes, the woman neither confirmed nor denied it immediately. Instead, she invited them in, saying simply, I have a story to tell you. The woman explained that after escaping the compound, she had walked for days, following streams, and eventually reaching the highway. A trucker had given her a ride to the next major town, where she had been too afraid to go to the police, convinced that Crane and Wells would find her. Instead, she had worked odd jobs, sleeping in shelters, gradually making her way north and west. I wanted to go home, she admitted, but I was terrified they would be watching my mother's house. She had eventually settled in Oregon, creating a new identity and building a quiet life as an artist who specialized in painted stone jewelry. When asked why she had never reached out to her mother after becoming an adult, her eyes filled with tears. At first it was fear, then shame for not being braver, and eventually, I convinced myself it would be cruel to reappear after so many years, that maybe she had found peace with losing me. She had followed news about the Pinecrest case over the years, even anonymously sending small donations to support search efforts. She had known about her mother's tireless advocacy, but had been paralyzed by the complexity of emotions surrounding her past. Is she still alive? The woman asked finally, her voice barely audible. My mother, When Amy nodded, the woman covered her face with her hands, decades of carefully constructed walls crumbling in an instant. The DNA test was a formality. Alina knew the moment she saw the woman that she was looking at her daughter. The resemblance was unmistakable, though Isabel now had her father's height and build. Their reunion was private, away from cameras and reporters, though Amy was permitted to wait outside. When she was finally invited in, she found the two women sitting close together on a sofa, Alina gently touching her daughter's face as if to confirm she was real. "She has been making rock jewelry," Alina told Amy with tears in her eyes. "All these years, she has been collecting beautiful stones, just like she did as a child." Isabel, who said she still thought of herself as Belle, explained that her workshop was full of rocks and minerals from across the country. She had built a successful small business, selling her creations online and at local markets. "I named my business Elena's Stones," she admitted softly. "It was my way of keeping her with me, even when I was too afraid to find her." The relationship between mother and daughter would take time to rebuild, but the foundation was there. A love that had never died, even when separated by decades and impossible circumstances. In the aftermath of the discoveries, Raymond Wells and the surviving cult leaders were charged with multiple felonies, including kidnapping, child endangerment, and, in some cases, manslaughter for the deaths that had occurred under their care. Many of the former children, now adults, struggled with how to proceed. Some wanted to reconnect with their original families. Others couldn't face the emotional complexity of such reunions. Several had children and even grandchildren of their own who knew nothing of their true origins. The legal system was ill-equipped to deal with the unique circumstances of the case. The statute of limitations had expired on many potential charges, and questions of accountability were complicated by the fact that some victims had become perpetrators over time, helping to maintain the system that had originally victimized them. Support groups formed for the survivors and their families, offering specialized therapy for the complex trauma they had experienced. The Pinecrest case became a landmark in the study of cults, child exploitation, and the long-term psychological effects of indoctrination at a young age. Amy's in-depth reporting on the case won national awards and brought attention to gaps in systems designed to protect children. Her series of articles highlighted how Gerald Thompson had slipped through background checks, how the isolated hunting lodge had never been connected to the disappearance, despite its proximity, and how the children's vulnerabilities had been identified and exploited by the perpetrators. She worked closely with child safety advocates to push for legislation, strengthening background checks for anyone working with children, and creating better cross-jurisdictional communication for cases of missing minors. Amy also documented the reunions, some joyful, some painfully awkward, as surviving parents met their now middle-aged children. Some families discovered they had grandchildren they'd never known existed. Others learned their children had died years earlier, bringing a different kind of closure than they had hoped for. Throughout it all, Amy maintained her relationship with Alina and Isabel, watching as they carefully rebuilt their bond, navigating the complex emotions of their decades apart. Isabel eventually decided to move back to Pinecrest, building a small house near her mother's. She brought her business with her, setting up a new workshop where she continued creating her stone jewelry. She also began speaking to groups about her experiences, particularly focusing on helping other survivors of manipulation and cult indoctrination. "The hardest part to explain to people," she told Amy during an interview for the one-year anniversary of her identification, "is how normal it all seemed after a while. How the unthinkable becomes every day when you're immersed in it." She described the slow process of mental liberation that had begun during her escape and continued for years. Afterward, "Even when I was physically free, my mind was still trapped in their rules and fears." Her story inspired others to come forward with their own experiences of exploitation and control. The Memorial Garden in Pinecrest was redesigned, with the stone benches now bearing accurate information about each person's fate. For those who had survived, the benches included not only their original names, but also the names they had lived with afterward, an acknowledgement of their complex identities and experiences. Elena and Isabel's story became one of healing and redemption, but it also highlighted how a single act of courage, Isabel's decision to escape into the desert, could alter the course of many lives. Had she not taken that risk, the truth might never have been discovered. Other survivors spoke of how they had looked up to the 14-year-old Isabel, how her defiance had planted seeds of doubt that would eventually lead to their own questioning of the community's leaders. She never stopped believing there was a different world out there, one survivor explained. She never stopped talking about her mother and the life she remembered. The investigation into the Pinecrest case continued, with authorities still searching for information about the 5 children whose fates remained unknown. But for Elena Reyes, the 41-year journey had reached its destination. "I always knew she was out there," she told Amy on the day Isabel moved into her new home in Pinecrest. "A mother knows. Even when everyone told me to accept that she was gone, I felt her presence in the world." As they sat together in Elena's garden, 3 generations of Reyes women, Elena, Isabel, and Isabel's daughter, placed painted rocks around a small fountain, building a colorful monument to resilience, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of family that had survived against impossible odds. 41 years after a yellow school bus disappeared on a foggy morning, the ripples of that event continue to spread through countless lives. The Pinecrest case changed how communities think about child safety, how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases, and how we understand the long-term effects of trauma and manipulation. For Amy Davidson, it reinforced her belief in the power of persistent investigation and the importance of never allowing stories to be forgotten. For the survivors, it offered various forms of closure and new beginnings, though many still struggle with the psychological aftermath of their experiences. For Elena Reyes, it brought the miracle she had never stopped believing in the return of her daughter. And for Isabel, it provided the chance to reclaim her original identity while honoring the strength that had allowed her to survive and create a life on her own terms. The story of the Pinecrest bus is not just about a tragic event or even its eventual resolution. It's about the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring power of hope, and the possibility of healing, even after decades of separation and pain.